Hi everyone. Quite often we need to access information in one script from another script, or we need something happening in one script to trigger a method in the other script. Let's look at a simple example where we have a player script and a user interface script. Say the player script has a health variable, and the UI script wants to access this variable so that it can display a health bar. We'll need to get a reference in the UI class to the player script. There are several ways to do this. For example, if we know the name of the object that the player script is attached to in the scene, we could use the gameObject.find method. We would pass the name of the object into the method, and it would return a reference to that game object. Then, by using the getComponent method, we could get the attached player script. Similarly, if we add a player tag to the player object, we could instead find the object with gameObject.findObjectWithTag. The most straightforward way, however, would be to use the findObjectOfType method and specify player as the type. This will search the scene for the object to which the player script is attached and return a reference to that instance of the player script. Once we have a reference to the player script using any of the above methods, we can access its public health variable and use this value to draw the health bar. Alright, so that's simple enough. Let's look at another case. Say that inside the player's update method, we have a check to see if the health variable has fallen below 0, at which point the player script will destroy the object it's attached to. Now, the player's death obviously signals the end of the game, so we'd want the UI script to be notified when the player dies so that it can display the words "Game Over" on the screen. We could start by creating a Game Over method in the UI class to write these words to the screen, but the method obviously still needs to be called from somewhere. The simplest solution would be to just get a reference to the UI class inside of the player script just before the object is destroyed. This reference could then be used to call the UI's GameOver method, which would of course then need to be made public. So this approach would work fine, but it's not really that great of a solution. To understand why, let's consider the relationship between the player class and the UI class. The UI class is responsible for displaying information about the player, so it makes sense that the UI class has a reference to the player. However, the player class shouldn't really have to care about the existence of the UI class. Put another way, if we were to delete the player class from the project, it makes sense that the UI script would no longer work. Its purpose was to display information about the player, and the player no longer exists. However, if we keep the player class and instead delete the UI class, it's bizarre that the player class should no longer work just because the UI has disappeared. With that in mind, let's look at events. Events are a relatively advanced topic, and we'll be exploring them in some depth later on. I think it's an important concept to be aware of from the beginning though, so I'd just like to show you enough to solve this basic problem. In the player class, I'll start by importing the system namespace, which will give us access to a thing called an action. We can now create a public event action and call it onPlayerDeath. When the player is about to die, we can invoke the action as though it were a method simply by writing its name followed by parentheses. Now for the interesting part. Inside the UI class, our reference to the player of course gives us access to the onPlayerDeath event. We can now write player.onPlayerDeath plus equals GameOver. This is called subscribing the GameOver method to the onPlayerDeath event. What happens now is that when onPlayerDeath is invoked, all methods that have been subscribed to the event will be called. In this case, of course, that's just the GameOver method. What's great about this is that the player doesn't care who, if anyone, is subscribed to the event. It's just responsible for triggering the event at the appropriate moment. So, if we now imagine that we delete the UI class, the player class still works fine. It never knew about the UI's existence in the first place. There is one small thing that we have to be careful of though. If nothing is subscribed to an event, then the event will be null. This means that if we try to invoke it, it will cause an error. So to prevent this, we simply add an if statement checking that the event is not null before we invoke it. Alright, so hopefully you now have a picture of the two main ways in which we can have classes interact with one another, either by a direct reference or with the help of an event. Until next time, cheers.